Let's bow our heads as we begin our meeting this evening. Lord, in this moment when the Sabbath is leaving us, we linger in your presence. Like the Jews who were so sad to see the Sabbath go and have to enter back into the work week, we want to stay in your presence just a little bit longer. And I pray that at this moment, the words of my mouth, the meditations of our hearts, will be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. It was a few months ago that Southern Adventist University's president, Dave Smith, called me up. And he said, "Doug, do you have somebody graduating this spring?" And I had to think a moment, because my daughters are well past college. Then it dawned on me that my older daughter was finishing her adult nurse practitioner certification. And I said, yeah, I think, she's finishing up those requirements. And they said, good, we'd like you to speak at the consecration service for the graduation on Friday night. And I thought, well, this is wonderful, because there's one thing about a preacher. And those of us that are preachers in the room know it's like a ball player never wants to sit on the bench, right? You always want to be on the field to play. And so if you have an opportunity to speak, that's a wonderful thing. My wife wishes it weren't so wonderful sometimes. She wishes that I would say no more often. But I thought, wow, what an opportunity to be able to speak to the last class while I'm working at Southern Adventist University. And then I had this really sort of reality check. Okay, what am I going to say to them? After 16 years here, and I realized that we both were graduating. This was wonderful. They were graduating with a 4-year degree, and I was graduating. I told them it only took me 4 times as long to get through college. It took me 16 years as a professor to get through college, but I'm finally graduating into retirement. I said, the only problem is that I'm graduating into the Sabbath of my life, and you're graduating into the Monday of your life. So you think about that for a moment. Now, I don't know where you are. Some of you may be graduating into the Monday of your life. By the looks of it, not so many of us. Some of you might be graduating into the middle of your life, the Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday, and some of you, like me, have arrived at the Sabbath of your life, where you now are in this moment. The question that all of us have to ask, and the question that I posed to the students that Friday consecration service is, when you wake up on Monday morning after you've graduated, what are you going to do with the rest of your life? What are you going to do on Monday morning? So I had to think of that. And as I thought of that, it brought me to 1 Peter chapter 4. 1 Peter chapter 4. No matter what stage we are in life, all of us are dealing with this question: what will we live the rest of our lives for? What truth will guide our lives? What will be our mission, our purpose, our goal? And I want to suggest to you that the foundation of a successful Christian life is knowing what you are living life for. Being clear about your priorities, about your mission in life. The Christian life is a calling. God has called us. He has consecrated us. He has set us apart, dedicated us to a sacred purpose. But what is our purpose? What have we been called for? Now, if you look on the screen, what does it say? Be the gospel. Is that a good purpose? I think so. God is calling us to be good news to other people. But then we have to ask ourselves the question, what is the gospel, right? And we've been defining that as we've gone through the weekend today. If you go to 1 Peter chapter 4, I want you to start with verse 1 and follow along with me as I read this. Peter says, "Since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourself also with the same attitude because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. Did Peter know what it was like to suffer in the body? He knew a lot about that. And notice what he says in verse 2. This is what I want to focus on first. As a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. So Peter is saying to us here that we can live our lives, there's only two possibilities. We can live our lives, first of all, for evil human desire, or we can live our lives for the will of God. And Peter's choice is very clear. Don't live your life for evil human desire, but rather for the will of God. Why? Why should we live for the will of God instead of for our own evil desires? Fast forward to verse 7. Fast forward to verse 7. What does he say? The end of all things is near. It's time to get serious about living for God. Now, if you were here with me this afternoon, we talked about how to find the good news in every text. And some of us might say, well, there it is, the end of all things is near. Now, the end of all things can be good news or bad news. If you're graduating from university, that's pretty good news for most students, isn't it? It's even better news for parents who have been footing the bill. I can guarantee you that. But sometimes the end of all things may not be good news. So, as we look at this, I want to point us to the next verse to find out what I think is the real good news in this passage. He says, Peter says, the end of all things is near. Be alert and of sober mind so that you may pray. And then look at verse 8. Above all, love each other deeply. Why? Why should we love each other deeply? Because love covers a multitude of sins. Love covers a multitude of sins. I want you to think about why Peter could say this. Why he knew how much love covers a multitude of sins. Think of the night of Jesus' crucifixion. You remember what Jesus told Peter before the cock crows twice? How many times will you deny me? 3 times, right? Peter boldly predicted, even if I have to die for you, I will never disown you. But that night, Peter fell asleep 3 times after Jesus pleaded with him to pray, and later 3 times he denied knowing Jesus with curses. I don't know this man you're talking about. He reverted back to that fisherman's mentality. Now, what I find amazing is, after Jesus' resurrection, who was the first disciple that Jesus appeared to? He appeared to Peter. And there's something about that appearance that strikes me recently as unusual. It's the only appearance that we know nothing about in the Gospels. Because it's mentioned incidentally, the Lord has also appeared to Peter, but the Bible never says anything. There was something so intimate, there was something so personal about Jesus coming and showing his love deeply to Peter that it was something that the Bible never shares with us, this personal interaction. But later, who was the one that preached the first sermon on the day of Pentecost? It was Peter, wasn't it? And Jesus specifically commissioned Peter to feed his flock. How did he feed his flock on the day of Pentecost? 3,000 people converted in one day. Peter writes in 1 Peter 3:18, Christ suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but he was made alive in the spirit. Jesus loved Peter, he loved you and me so deeply that he personally took on the guilt of every sinner and every sin ever committed. He suffered for each one of those sins. He was put to death in his body so that you and I would not have to die. When you think about this, how deeply Jesus loved, he loved so deeply that that love penetrated to the very bottom of the landfill of sin in this world and covered over every sin that has ever been committed. There's no sin so low that Jesus' love cannot go lower and deeper and cover that sin. And we have the hope of eternal life today because of that deep, deep love of Jesus Christ and his resurrection from the dead. So Peter says the end of all things is near. And because the end of all things is near, above all else, love deeply, because our love also covers a multitude of sins. You know, it's easy in today's world to have our purpose covered over by all kinds of other stuff, isn't it? Just the day-to-day events of life. But I believe the will of God is for you to consecrate yourself, to dedicate your life to loving deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. Peter then writes another verse, and this is how I discovered this passage. Because I was looking for something to do. You know, it's a strange thing. Those of you, how many of you here have experienced retirement? Let me just see your hands. Okay, so I'm among friends, right? I can talk about this. June 1, when I retired, I suddenly realized for the first time in my life, I didn't have to go to work. For 43 years, I had been a pastor and a professor. I had a job to do. I had a purpose in life. Suddenly, I could choose anything I wanted to do in the world and do that, subject to my wife's approval, of course. But other than that, you know, I was kind of like, wow, what am I going to do? And then one day as I was reading, and you know, sometimes we read various translations not because one is better than the other, but because one verse in a translation may speak to us in a very special way. Just that day, that translation is put in a certain way. So this is a 2011 NIV. It's not a better or worse translation than any other. But here's what it says in verse 10 of chapter 4. How should we love deeply? Before verse 10, it says, offer hospitality without grumbling. Hopefully we did that. But then it says in verse 10, each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others. And then it goes on, as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. Some translations say in its manifold forms or whatever. That didn't speak to me. But when I read a faithful steward of God's grace in its various forms, I said to myself, how many different ways has God given me grace? How many different ways has He given you grace? How many different ways can you show that grace to other people? And I just thought about all the various ways that God was calling me to share His grace with other people. It could be something little, it could be something big, but I realized that here was a life verse for me. This was my goal for the rest of my life, to be a faithful steward of God's grace in its various forms. Whatever way God gave it to me. You know, I don't know how God is going to do that, but I want to use it that way. In other words, I'm to use anything that God has gifted me with to love others deeply. And that love will cover over the hurts, the sickness, and the sins which destroy our lives. One way came to me in an interesting way. My insurance agent and I have become friends. He's a Presbyterian, and I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. We share the fact that years and years ago in Chattanooga, there was a Presbyterian preacher that was known throughout the United States for his TV program by the name of Ben Hayden. He had a program called Change Lives, a wonderful preacher. And my insurance agent, Don Self, loved his preacher, Ben Hayden. And when he found out that I loved his preacher, well, I was a good guy then. When he found out that I taught homiletics, he started sending me CDs of Ben Hayden's sermons. He invited me to the prayer breakfast with 2,000 other people in downtown Chattanooga. And then he said, we have a Monday Bible study group. We'd like you to join the group. So there I am every Monday in the Acropolis restaurant near the mall in Chattanooga, sitting around a table with other business people, and they're Presbyterians and they're Baptists and they're interdenominational. And here's this Seventh-day Adventist that's sitting there at the table. And you know what we're doing? We're going through 1 Peter. It's an amazing thing. And these businessmen are just sitting there wrestling with how they can use the various gifts that God has given them to serve other people. And I said, wow, God gave me this opportunity. He just handed it to me because of the invitation. I don't know how God is going to work with you, but God will give you times when you can reach out and you can work with people and you can use your gifts. It's interesting, an illustration. I don't know how many of you have read C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia. Some of you who are raising your hands, you love that book. You remember that in The Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis reimagines the cosmic conflict, the great controversy between Jesus and Satan, and he reimagines it taking place in a world of talking animals and trees called Narnia. A witch, who represents the devil, has cast a spell of winter over the land, and she has turned to stone anyone serving Aslan, the lion who represents Jesus Christ. But when 4 children of Adam's race find their way to Narnia, they discover that the witch's spell of winter is weakening because Aslan is about in the land. As Jesus' power comes into the land, the spell of Satan weakens. Now, if you've read the first book or watched the movie, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you remember that as the youngest child, Lucy, and her siblings enter Narnia, they're caught up in the conflict. But Lucy receives a gift of a bottle cordial, which is a healing liquid which can make people well. And in the ultimate battle scene in that movie, as the forces of Aslan and the forces of the White Witch fight to the death, the White Witch using her, and I'm going to go to the other mic here, just because this mic, the battery is dying. If you have a handheld, maybe you can just bring me the handheld. But as the battle is raging, are we on this one? Let me turn this off. There we go. As the battle is raging and the witch is using her powers to turn Aslan's forces to stone, Aslan gives to Lucy and her sister Susan the work of bringing the characters turned to stone, the soldiers, bringing them back to life by applying drops of that cordial in their lives. So they go around and they anoint each person that has died with this liquid, and it brings them back to life again. And as I thought about that, and as I thought about the work that we have to do, our work, thanks for that mic. Okay, there we go. Now I can walk around again. Our work is to apply the healing drops of God's love to anyone who has been affected by Satan. As a university professor, I saw this in the lives of my students. In fact, the student that introduced me at that consecration service, A.J. Sato, was the president of the Enactus Club. The Enactus Club is a business club that does community service. And they had taken on, this seems a little hot to me, the mic, they had taken on a project in India at a hospital called Ruby Nelson Memorial Hospital in Jalandhar, India. What they had realized was that this hospital is a pioneer in the work of providing sight to people in India. Many people in India have cataracts, and a doctor in India has perfected a cataract lens that cost about $20. They can do these surgeries by the hundreds in a single day. Teams go in and people come in on the operation day, and for about $20, they can put in lenses in their eyes and they can cure them of their cataracts. In fact, this is being done around the world. I had a student that was going to North Korea with a team as a translator to provide vision in that country. But Enactus, as a business club, realized that these people, now that they have their sight, need a way to earn their living. And so they were raising money for microloans so that they could give these people money to start a business and now have a way to earn their living and feel like they were no longer having to beg or do something. It was a wonderful project, and I just saw the healing drops of God's love going from Southern Adventist University over to Ruby Nelson Memorial Hospital in Jalandhar, India. And I told A.J. Sato, I said, that's amazing, because as a child, I went right through Jalandhar. I remember it well. We stopped there and we visited that place. And I remember Ruby Nelson. You see, Ruby Nelson was the wife of a doctor in India. One day they were traveling in India and their tire went flat. The doctor left his wife by the well at a village, went into town to get the tire changed, and when he came back, he found his wife had been murdered. And unfortunately, it was a sad situation. It happened when I was probably about 12 years old, and it was especially difficult for me because 3 weeks earlier, our car had broken down in the worst bandit territory in all of India. And a man in India saw our distress at sunset, towed us into town, put us in a government guest house, sent his mechanic back the next day to get our car fixed, and basically saved our lives. And then 3 weeks later, Ruby Nelson was murdered in India. Today, that hospital is named in her memory. And today, hundreds and thousands of people are getting their eyesight back again because of the memory of Ruby Nelson and the sacrifice of love that she made in India. But that's not the end of the story. Last week, I was in the Halsey Wellness Center at Southern Adventist University, and one of my former students called out and said, "Hi, Dr. Jacobs, how are you doing?" And I did my workout, and just as I was leaving the gym, a young man came up to me and he said, "Are you Dr. Jacobs?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "I heard Daniel call you by your name, and I just wanted to meet you." He said, "I also am friends with A.J. Sato, and he told me that you had been to Ruby Nelson Memorial Hospital and to Jalandhar, and he told me that you were from India." He said, "I just want to meet you because I'm Ruby Nelson's great-grandson." So I talked to him, Alex Nelson, and I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm graduating in December. I'm pre-physician's assistant." He said, "I'm a Spanish major, and before I go to PA school, I'm going to Italy and learning Italian because," he says, "I want to use my degree as a missionary to serve others." The tradition, the drops of love, are continuing in the life of individuals. You never know when one drop of love is going to make a difference in somebody else's life. During my last semester at school, every day, there was a student that brought a piece of artwork into class. And I was fascinated by it because she told me that it was a picture of a little girl from Bangladesh. Evidently, in her art class, they had been given photographs of orphans. And each day when she would come into class, she'd be carrying this art paper that she had been, doing colored pencil work on and drawing this. And it was, when it got done, it was so beautiful that I tried to buy it from her because I thought my parents have been missionaries in Bangladesh and I want this. And she said, "Oh, no, you can't have it, but you can go look at all the portraits because every one of us has a different orphan. And when the artwork is done, we are giving those portraits, those personal portraits, to the orphans in Bangladesh who have nothing but will have a beautiful personal portrait." Would you like to see the picture? Here it is, right there. That is the picture. Isn't that gorgeous? And that girl in Bangladesh and all the ones in the class are going to have their personal portrait in that beautiful form to say you're valued, you're worth something. Drops of love that are being scattered throughout the world by students at Southern Adventist University. You know, if I've learned anything over 43 years of active ministry, it is that ministry is far more about relationships than programs. I got to tell you, I've been to a lot of pastoral farewells, mine and others included. And Pastor Ed, I have never been to a farewell and heard somebody stand up and say of their pastor, "Pastor, I'm going to miss your sermons." They don't say that. I wish they would. I mean, it would make me feel better about all the sermons that I preached. But they never say that. You know what they say? They say, "Pastor, you were there for me when my mother died, and you stayed in the hospital for hours with me." That's what they say. You were there. You were there through the time when my son or my daughter had that problem. Thank you for bringing back my loved one into the church. When I lost my job, the church was there for me. It's all about the love. It's all about the relationships. That's what people remember. One day I was called to the emergency room. 13-year-old girl in our church by the name of Charlene was seizuring in the ER. When I got in there, she was really, really sick, and they finally diagnosed her with cat scratch fever. She was taken to All Children's Hospital in St. Petersburg. I think she was 50 days in a drug-induced coma with her brainwaves flat to prevent her from seizuring. She had a bed. You know, I know there are medical people in the room, so forgive me if I don't say this right, but it had a computer screen. She had about 7 IV pumps. The bed would do everything for her. It would go this way and that way and up and down and everything. She was on a special diet that they discovered in research. One day I went in there and they said, "She needs blood." Now you got to realize that I like my own blood, and I've never given blood. And I basically felt like, even though my wife and children told me that I was stupid, but basically that I needed all my blood, and if I gave it to somebody else, I might feel faint and weak and stuff like that. So I just don't give blood. But here I was in the hospital that day, and Charlene needed the blood, and I had the same type blood that she had, and I just was all out of excuses, and I said, "Where's the blood bank?" And they said, "It's down the street." So I went down the street, lay down on the couch there, and they stuck the needle in my arm, and I watched my life blood force flow out of my limbs, you know, and I just was laying there. I sat up, and I started feeling faint after it was all done, and the nurse plied me with crackers and orange juice. I survived, and I wasn't the worse for wear, and Charlene got the blood that she needed. Something happened that day because Charlene had her pastor's blood in her. Probably not mine, but I had given it for her. And to this day, decades later, whenever we see each other, she survived. She was able to recover enough to go back to work. She got married. And when we see each other, there's one thing that we do. We wrap our arms around each other because we are now blood relatives. We are people that share that common love for each other in a way that I share with nobody else. Because I have to tell you, I still am a little squeamish about somebody sticking a needle in my arm. But if you need it, you know who to call if you have O-negative blood. I've got to tell you that Peter is calling us to reconsecrate our lives to loving deeply. But you say, "Doug, how can I love everybody on planet Earth?" You know how many people there are? I looked it up. 7.6 billion people on planet Earth, moving toward 8 billion. You know, my church, I don't know how big your church is. It has 50, 100, 200 members. What are we going to do, even if we love deeply? I have 2 answers for you. One answer is, to the person that you love deeply, that changes their world completely. And God is calling us to love one person at a time. I am convinced that in the Bible, we are not called to love the whole world, but Jesus came and loved people individually. And that's what God is calling us to. But I'm also convinced that in today's world more than ever, one person can make a difference. Who ever heard of Marjorie Stoneham Douglas High School until that fateful day when a gunman came in and shot many students there, 17 of them. And within days, the names and faces of Cameron Kasky, David Hogg, Emma Gonzalez, and others were known around the world. as they spoke out and said, "Never again." It doesn't matter whether we agree with what they did or whether we don't agree with what they did. What we have to realize is that within a day or two, one individual can be known worldwide in today's world and can make a radical, radical difference. And imagine if Seventh-day Adventist Christians were known worldwide because of the radical nature of their deep love for others. Jesus had only 12 disciples, right? But they transformed the world. And you know, when those Marjorie Stoneham Douglas students became well-known all over the world, people said, well, adults must be doing something. Those students can't do it. And you know what I said? I said, I've got a dozen students in my classes that can do better than those students. The students that we have today, the young people, have so many talents and abilities that we just got to turn them loose, and we've got to realize that we have the potential to transform the world. They did it to save lives here on earth, a worthy goal. But Peter tells us that because the end of all things is near, we are called to use our talents to save people, not in this life, but for eternity. And I just have to say this. It's time we as parents and older friends stop criticizing our young adults and started turning them loose to serve God and the service of God's grace. We need to consecrate them instead of criticize them. I am tempted to go on a diversion, but I will not. That's all I'm going to say. But I've got to tell you that young adults today have abilities and powers that we don't even think of. One of my preaching students went to work for McKee's as a digital strategist. And Bryant Rodriguez is not even 25, I don't think. And he sent out one tweet that had thousands upon thousands of responses and got McKee Baking Company mentioned on every major news show in America. You know what the tweet was? Some of us older people won't get it. He just said, "One gotta go." And he mentioned the 4 top brands of cookies that they make. There's evidently a popular meme out there that asks you, if you had to give up one of your children, which one would you give up? If you had to give up one of this, which one would you give up? And basically people were afraid that their favorite cookie was going to disappear. And so this went viral. It went all over the United States and on the major newscast. One tweet did that. Imagine what would happen if we turned people loose and we could see that kind of results with loving deeply. I've got to tell you, it's time for us to allow this to happen. My younger daughter lived with us for several years through college and beyond. I felt because she was in my home that I had to enforce a certain style of living. One day, I said to my wife, I can't keep doing this, I just have to love her. It took a few years. But when I stopped trying to force conformity and I started loving deeply, things changed. And it made a huge difference in our relationship. In the second half of 1 Peter 4:7, Peter says, "Be alert and of sober mind so that you may pray." Another translation reads, "Think rightly and be clear-minded so that you can pray." In other words, be awakened to the needs of those around us so that we can pray for those needs and pray for God's strength to love deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. What I'm calling us to do is to be much more aware of the world. It's not enough to love deeply, but it needs to be aware of what we have to love in the world today. And I want to ask you to consecrate yourself to this mission. And I want you to listen again to verses 7 through 11 of 1 Peter 4. Notice what he says, "The end of all things is near. Therefore be alert and of sober mind so that you may pray. Above all, love deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins." Verse 9, "Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling." And then the verse that is my life verse, "Each of you should use whatever gift you've received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms." Verse 11, "If anyone speaks, they should do so as one who speaks the very words of God. If anyone serves, they should do so with the strength God provides, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. To him be the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen." It was in 1977 that a young woman of Lutheran background was spiritually searching. She had had a near-death experience, and that drove her to go to a Christian college. One day she met a Seventh-day Adventist. She discovered the truth of the Bible as God has gifted our church with, and suddenly everything fell into place. It was just like her eyes were open and the whole Bible made sense to her. And she said, "I was just on fire, and I was so in love with Jesus, and I was so in love with his truth that I thought that if I just could share it with everybody, everybody else would see it, and they would believe it as well." In fact, she was so in love with Jesus, she wanted to be baptized immediately, and the person that was studying with her said, "Wouldn't it be a good idea to actually go to an Adventist church on Sabbath before you're baptized?" And she said, "Well, that might be a good idea." So she went to church and she was baptized, and 3 weeks later she was selling Adventist books door to door. She was still so much of a Lutheran that she had a little bit of trouble giving up worshiping on Sunday. So she went to church on Sabbath, and then on Sunday she'd go to the Lutheran church. She was selling books in Pensacola, Florida, and the Lutheran church that she went to happened to be right near the Naval Air Station. And in the Naval Air Station was a young officer, a navigator on one of the Navy planes by the name of Kent Forrester. And so she started talking with him and started sharing her faith. And she got so excited about this that she began taking him to the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Pensacola. And before long, well, he was a little harder to convince than she had been, but she gave him a book by Ray Holmes, our professor. His wife wrote a book about a stranger in my house, how she became an Adventist and her husband was still a Lutheran pastor. And that book convinced Kent, who was also a Lutheran, to become a Seventh-day Adventist. Well, Kent went to the Seventh-day Adventist church and he saw a very nice-looking girl there by the name of Jeannie. He married Jean, eventually moved to Oak Ridge, and yesterday I visited Jeannie and Kent in Oak Ridge because Jeannie happens to be my first cousin. And in fact, I sang at Kent and Jeannie's wedding 41 years ago in 1977. When we got there yesterday, we were talking about this girl that had converted Kent to Seventh-day Adventist. And we wondered what happened to her. This afternoon, after my afternoon presentation, a lady walked up to me. And she said, "You know, I knew a Doug Jacobs, and I wonder if you're the one that I knew. Did you have relatives in Pensacola? Did you have a sister that died overseas? Because my sister had died while my parents were missionaries." I said, "Yes." "Did you have a cousin that married Kent Forrester?" And I said, "Yes, I was just talking to them yesterday." She says, "Well, I'm Mary Kane, who lives here in Greeneville." And she said, "I am the one that was there at that time." As I thought about that story this afternoon, I just said, "You got to sit down and tell us what happened." 41 years later, I met again the young lady who had brought my cousin's husband into the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And she told me something this afternoon because I had met her there, and I had, in fact, written letters to her for a while after that. She said, I was so on fire for the Lord that first year that I was a Seventh-day Adventist, she said, I saw 5 people won to the Lord and baptized, just because I just was so on fire for what God had done for me and what I could do for others. Friends, when we love Jesus Christ, when Jesus Christ has done something for us, and when we share that as a gift of love to others, when we love deeply and share that, wonderful things happen because love covers a multitude of sins. Let's pray. Father, this weekend we've explored your gospel, how we can be the gospel as we love others the way that Jesus has loved us, as we're neighbors to others, and most of all, as we love deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. Help us, each one of us, to be stewards of God's grace, sharing that grace as drops of love with everyone that we come in contact with, because we believe that soon and very soon you're coming back again, and we want as many as possible to be waiting with us for you. Maranatha, come soon, Lord, we pray. Amen.